Good afternoon again. Thank you very much for your patience. We're now going to continue with what will be the final session for today. It's a very rare thing that you have as many historians on tap to answer questions, and we will be having a panel at the end of David's next presentation. It's a rare opportunity for you to get into the minds of these people and forward the questions again via the app to me so that we can draw on their expertise and really take home some of those noteworthy lessons from today. We've already heard from David Kohnen previously today. We enjoyed that, and I'm sure that you'll enjoy his next presentation just as much. Please welcome David Kohnen.
What a great honor it is for me to be able to address this audience. It's also my first time in Australia, so thank you for having me, and I'm going to throw some things out here, primarily from an American perspective, but as maritime history is a global discussion, I look forward to the Q&A after my presentation. Navies require personnel with technical expertise for the practical purposes of operating ships. Given the technical focus of the profession, naval officers frequently tend to view historical study as a worthy hobby, but lacking in practical purpose. Challenging these notions, U.S. Navy Rear Admiral Stephen B. Luce drew from the teachings of British historians like Sir John Knox Lawton, Philip Cullum, Spencer Wilkinson, and others in organizing the U.S. Naval War College. Luce warned War College students to study history for their own professional good. Luce observed, quote, "Examples of history which inculcate these lessons are being disregarded every day by nearly all maritime powers, and by none more than our own." Luce argued, all naval operations are strategic, whether peace or war. Given these assertions, Luce might warn us in the 21st century context to avoid the unending wars that we have seen since the Second World War. It's important to understand that Luce would have told you to achieve desired end states that are clearly defined in order to secure the sustainable peace end objective in war. Given this quasi-war that has become so popular, Luce might warn us today in the 21st century context to not talk about being a, quote, war fighter. Given these assertions, it's important to remember that over a century ago, Luce challenged practitioners to understand that naval strategy is, quote, more comprehensive than land strategy. Land strategy is called into play only during war. He then argued that naval strategy adopts some of its most important measures during peace. Luce stood out in his time, challenging service norms and sparking a professional revolution from within the ranks. Among others, Luce famously conscripted to this cause Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan to the Naval War College. He also used history as a weapon, framing the American concept of, quote, sea power, invoking the Nelsonian traditions of service in discussing the actual functions of naval power. Luce and Mahan sparked a debate about the functional value of history. Engineers within the ranks favored the process and solutions that are prevalent in the sciences. Mahan lamented in that book that he wrote in 1890 that, quote, he witnessed the, quote, vague feeling of contempt for the past, supposed to be obsolete, combines with the natural indolence of men to blind them even to those permanent strategic lessons which lie close to the surface of naval history. Today, we happy few active maritime historians recognize the practical importance of understanding history within the context of the past, right? But, my learned friends, we frequently fail to understand the more immediate needs of our poor naval practitioner. At the beginning of the 20th century, history enabled the Americans to prove the value of sea power, not as a means to conduct war necessarily, but as a means to preserve peace and stability in the global commons. Indeed, the ideas of Lawton, Wilkinson, Luce, and Mahan remained important in the era of the First Great War of the 20th century. The deaths of Mahan in 1914 and Luce in 1917 also marked a new generation of rising naval professionals. Royal Navy Admiral Sir John Rushworth Jellicoe and U.S. Navy Captain William S. Sims maintained a close personal correspondence. Experience in a dirty and widely ignored campaign in China in 1900 first inspired this special relationship between Jellicoe and Sims. First World War experiences together inspired Sims in his second tenure as president of Naval War College. Among other radical initiatives, Sims drew inspiration from the Admiralty, quote, historical section of Sir Julian Corbett, which served as an adjunct to the Naval Intelligence Division at the Admiralty during the First World War. In 1919, Sims established his own historical section at the United States Naval War College. So the Americans are basically absorbing ideas from their British friends. Sims empowered Dudley Knox to put together a historical section in order to establish means to use history in the classroom setting to show practitioners how to employ naval forces in such a way that a war could be averted. His protege, Dudley Knox, wrote that navies are for the preservation of peace, not to be predatory, but to shield the free development of commerce, not to unsettle the world, but to stabilize it through the promotion of law and order. With Sims backing the effort, Knox organized a panel consisting of Captain Ernest J. King and Commander William S. Pye. In 1919, this so-called Knox-King Pye Board determined that U.S. naval officers generally suffered from being educated, quote, only to the lowest commission grade. In other words, the ensigns being commissioned at the Naval Academy, that was the end of their education. And because of their findings, they said that naval officers have to be constantly re-educated throughout the course of their career. Indeed, such conclusions that officers were only educated to the lowest commission grade caused significant controversy within the Navy Department of the United States. Although the original Knox-Pye-King report was suppressed, the text mysteriously appeared in the Naval Institute proceedings in August of 1920. It should be noted that the acquisitions editor at Naval Institute proceedings was none other than Ernest King. Acting upon the Knox-Pye-King report, Sims recruited his wartime intelligence officer, Tracy Barrett Kittredge, to serve as a librarian at the Naval War College. Sims provided a blank check, expanding the library collection from roughly 7,000 volumes to over 45,000 books, to include 49 first editions of Corbett's works. So, the point being, the British Empire was inspiring the Americans to examine how the United States fit into the global context. From these rich historical foundations of Britannia, Sims expanded the curriculum to integrate historical case studies with wargaming or chart maneuver reconstructions. From the American Civil War, the 1904 Battle of Tsushima, and of course, after 19, the Battle of Jutland, served as the culminating case study for questions of strategic command, intelligence, logistics, and the basic capability of knowing how to make a decision in the fog of war. With the advent of unification in the armed services, the delineations between traditional military strategy and naval theory became muddled. Army and Air Force thinkers of the 20th century ultimately failed to understand the unique function of navies in both peace and war. Twice serving as the American Secretary of State, once as the Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson recalled in memoirs that whenever I had dealings with the Navy Department, they would fade into a dim world in which, quote, Neptune was God, Mahan his prophet, and the Navy the only true church. This quotation has often been misrepresented as a critique of the Navy, whereas we can read this critique as being actually an example of him recognizing that the naval practitioners understood the basics of their service profession. Now, with the creation of the United States Air Force and centralization under the concept of unification, the U.S. Navy forgot a lot of the lessons that it had taught itself about sea power from a British point of view. Just 20 years after the First World War, Ernest King commanded at the strategic levels as Nimitz orchestrated operations during battles that far exceeded the Battle of Jutland and Coral Sea, and Midway and Guadalcanal and Leyte Gulf all became the basis for American service education after the Second World War. Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King concluded that, quote, no matter how ingenious the war machines, no matter how marvelous the developments of science, we must always remember that wars of the future, if more wars there must be, will be similar to the wars of the past. Looking outward to the future, King thought we must, if you like, paraphrase the phrase, quote, waging war. Why should we not make as much effort to win the peace as we do to win the war? Why should we not wage peace? Based upon his study of history, Ernest J. King concentrated upon the transcendent factors which have always influenced the strategic context, noting conditions which have arisen from time to time by reason of the evolution of weapons and the advent of new degrees of mobility and maneuver. He warned against the false assumption about progress in technology, unquote. Considering the interrelationships of strategy and technology, King took the humanistic approach in considering that the nexus between peace and war centered upon the question of, quote, our altruism and our strong inclination to play, quote, citizen fix-it, have combined to involve us in much more deeply than is necessary or desirable, even though not initially intended, unquote. King understood the stakes in war, having considered the disasters of the past through his own historical studies. Although military practitioners must always seek means to offset the prospect of war, scholarly historians must also come down off the ivory tower and recognize that practitioners have a very difficult job to do, particularly when a dedicated adversary is intent on having a war. Historians must re-engage the practitioner. Indeed, Sir Michael Howard, in his ironically titled The Lessons of History, concluded that there are no lessons of history, unquote. Peter Perret has similarly suggested that, quote, the greatest threat to historical scholarship remains where it has always been, in the coercive intent and power of orthodoxy, whether old or new. Just 100 years ago, the U.S. Navy stood in the shadows of the European navies as American forces learned how to operate within the context of modern coalition warfare. Today, as the U.S. Navy and its global partners sail into the hazy, uncharted waters of the future, history remains clearly visible in the phosphorescent wake. Reconsidering the influence of the First Great War upon the Second Good War of the 20th century as it slipped into a Cold War, we can see continuities in the history of the past that can be applied to future scenarios. We must avoid the prospect of falling into a trap in endless wars, such as those that we have seen in more recent years. Historical myths and popular memory fuel problems of strategic importance to all humanity. Indeed, practitioners in the military and naval services have the most to lose when our fellow humans mimic mistakes of the past in creating future wars. Whilst all of us will eventually become part of history, contemporary strategic thinkers must aggressively study the past in order to shape our future. To start, we must abandon this term warfighter. We have to revisit the mindset of waging peace, as King called it, into the 21st century and beyond. As Mahan and Corbett remind us in their writings, we must seek to understand the timeless lessons awaiting to be rediscovered through documentary research, not just secondary reading, and actually come to an understanding of the lessons which truly do lie just beneath the surface of naval history. With that, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, David. I found that absolutely fascinating. The names Luce, Mahan, Sims, well known to many of us who've studied naval history. I actually would like to direct my first question to you, if I may. And I was wondering whether you might illuminate us the relationship that those three men in particular had with President Theodore Roosevelt.
So, is this on? So Theodore Roosevelt was a historian in his own right who studied the War of 1812 and was inspired by the Civil War uncle that he had who lived in Liverpool during the Civil War, John Bullock. I'm a big Beatles fan, by the way, and so I went to Liverpool and I saw the Western approaches and went down to Matthew Street and saw the Cavern Club, and right nearby is the old Confederate Navy headquarters. History truly did inspire Teddy Roosevelt, but the associations with people like Luce and Mahan also helped sort of frame Roosevelt's worldview. And one of the interesting lines of research that I think all of us have an opportunity to weigh in on is that early concept that the British came up with, sort of rebranding the empire as, quote, imperial federation. And it's this idea of an imperial federation that Alfred Mahan sort of latched onto and Teddy Roosevelt sort of agreed with, that fueled the idea that we saw at Versailles of a League of Nations. And I'm really interested right now in my own research about the correspondence between naval thinkers after the First World War about how to make this League of Nations Navy concept work. And of course it didn't work. And so it's interesting when you then get to Casablanca Conference 43, when Winston Churchill's talking about the importance of empire and the restoration of the order of empire. Franklin Roosevelt says, well, we're going to do the United Nations. And Churchill said, well, it didn't work before, why are we going to do that again? So it's an interesting discussion, and I think there's still a lot of work for historians to do. I would hasten to say that the purpose of my remarks today was to challenge practitioners to recognize that what historians do is actually pretty hard work. It's a lot like intelligence gathering, except without the satellite feed. There's a lot of answers to questions that you're asking that exist in archives today. And those archives have been untapped in large measure because in many respects, even though the taxpayers have already paid for those archives, they're largely uncatalogued, and therefore historians have a hard time getting to those sources. So to the practitioners of the world, support your archivists and historians if you want to win the next war.
Thank you, David. The next question is in general to the panel. 36 countries, 3 continents within the multi-billion blue economy. What other local actions and global influence can Australia have within their area of operations? Is there someone who'd like to have a stab at that? So just again, 36 countries, 3 continents within the multi-billion blue economy. What other local actions and global influence can Australia have within its area of operations?
Okay, I'll have a stab. So I think, one of the key things that recently the University of New South Wales, Canberra and the Naval Institute did was ran a seminar about trade. And there was a lot of information that came out about trade, but what it highlighted was our huge dependence on trade. It's the complex webs that we have with trade, but also the way that trade links us in unexpected ways. James Goldrick's talked in the past about some of the unpicking that the Admiralty did in World War I about trade, trying to understand that. So, for example, one of our, I think it's number 3 or number 4 sources of oil for Australia is actually China. And so I think in answer to the question is better understanding the interrelationships we have, and trade is a really good way in which to understand those intricacies. and getting to know the environment, and also realising the huge importance we have in terms of trade, both in terms of our exports, but more particularly just to maintain a complex and advanced society in a global world. Trade is probably our biggest single issue.
Thank you, Peter. Again, a next one to the panel broadly. How do you view the evolving challenges and threats in Australia's area of operations as compared to those in the past? Is there someone who'd like to have a crack at that one?
So I want to come back to what someone mentioned before, which is climate change. So we know you can't force structure to stop climate change, but we're going to have to more and more force structure to mitigate the effects that climate change causes. And I think in particular, there's the possibility, if we use our strategic imagination, to have to consider that the effects of climate change, particularly on the small nation states in the Indo-Pacific region, has the potential to cause all types of different levels of conflict, and particularly internal conflict that we might be called on to support or to mitigate, whether it's with the UN or with coalitions and allies. So I think well, we all know that high-end warfighting and major conflict is an existential threat to us. There is, I think, a much greater propensity to have a proliferation of small events and issues in the globe that will affect the way that we operate as the effects of climate change accelerate, as 99.99995% of scientists in the world that tell us. I was at a conference in Canberra that the Sea Power Centre with the Army Centre put on, and one of the most harrowing things was I saw the Deputy Director of the Climate Change Institute at ANU give a presentation there that just, I think, boggled everyone in the audience about how potentially bad those effects are. And I think we are drastically underestimating it. And it's sad to say we have a government at the moment that is both financially blind to it, but strategically blind to it as well.
Thank you.
Could I add on to that? I think we really have to think about what it means to be the so-called security partner of choice in the Pacific, and sort of really consider how our strategic priorities intersect with those of our neighbours, and kind of very much listen to those neighbours, and how things like climate change, particularly climate change, because we keep hearing that with our Pacific neighbours, how that is affecting them, and sort of ensuring that all countries can sort of benefit from a 21st century Indo-Asia Pacific, and we really sort of, in a way we never have before, have to step up to a leadership role. That's sort of a difference, I think, from sort of the challenges we face today to those that we've faced in the past.
Geoffrey, would you like to comment on that?
This is, yeah. Far be it from me as a Brit to tell Australians what to do, but it does seem to me that we're all in the same sort of situation, and this is something that we all need to recognise. The fact that there is, in fact, a lot of common interest. I don't mean just between Australia and the UK. I mean between all nations of the world, and dealing with climate change is one of them. But defending globalisation, it seems to me, is another. Basically, what's under challenge at the moment is a whole set of kind of assumptions that draw us together to cooperate against common threats, whatever those common threats are, whether they're climate change, or whether they're international piracy, or terrorism, or whatever it is. And there does seem to me to be a dismaying mood, shall we say, in the world for us to withdraw into our own silos, concentrate on our own issues, and maybe to forget the degree to which we have common interests. And that, I think, is a very worrying development, because it is encouraging a drift back to interstate global competition, and also blinding us to what are the real threats in many cases as well. So, I think the thing that Australia has and must do, and the thing that the UK must have and must do, and most other countries as well, is just to concentrate on the fact that we're all in the same boat, almost literally. And that ought to be a much greater focus of national priority than, unfortunately, it looks like.
I think that's a point well made. Thank you, Geoffrey. The next question is directed to Richard and Nicole. Any comments on Australia's fuel storage policy and threats to operations? Microphone.
I'm assuming current storage capacity. I haven't looked at the current situation, unfortunately, so I can't speak to that. Going on my own research, it was a big thing back then. It was a lot of money and manufacturing capacity and everything was put into increasing the oil storage at the time. I haven't unfortunately gotten to the modern day, so I can't say for that, but yeah.
I think more broadly there are a whole host of issues. I think oil security is one which has attracted a lot of attention and there's been a lot of focus upon it. But more generally, resilience of sort of economic systems and resilience of the methods of supply is really important if we are looking, as some people suggest, at fighting, potentially having to fight a more high intensity type conflict. The obvious question that then comes into it is that the issue which I think Pete has raised is where do you place your priorities in terms of making these kind of strategic decisions, because these things take a lot of investment, and do you actually invest in your more low-end capability, more high probability issues of climate change, etc., or do you focus on your low probability but high risk issues which require you to invest quite heavily in sort of a lot of serious infrastructure as well as the high-end capability that you need to actually conduct a war against a major power?
Peter Jones, would you like to comment?
Yeah, this is a great question in terms of a really good example where history can help. So at the Gold Examiner, when we looked at trade, one of the things we stumbled on was the Imperial Defence Committee in the 1920s, 1930s, had a whole series of committees that reported to the Imperial Defence Committee, which in turn to the UK government, on areas like fuel, foodstuffs, ports, shipping. And so you had a very elaborate system which informed government on risks to not only to the British economy but to the imperial broader economic environment. And they used that system to first off understand the problems and come up with risk mitigation to address the vulnerabilities that they had in their economy. And I would argue today in Australia we do not have anything approaching that level of sophistication. And I'd really encourage people to look at what they were doing, in the 1920s as a really good example of trying to mitigate the risks that we currently face in these sort of areas, particularly in a globalised or exposed economy.
Thank you, Peter. Again, the next one is in general to the panel. Rules-based order. How does engagement with the United States fit into our broader diplomacy, and how will this relationship evolve? Anyone?
I'll have a stab at this because the ARC is funding me to answer that question at the moment in another project with another academic who's here talking tomorrow at the conference. I think we're at a really important inflection point of debate about our relationships in the region and our great and powerful friends' relationships as well. So I agree with the notion around leadership, but I think we also have to understand in the region that by 2050, Indonesia will be probably the fourth largest economy in the world. We're in a position where we've probably peaked at our terms of global economic influence, and there's really only one way for us to go, not because of our decline, but relative to the rise of other powers. That is also true for the United States of America. I think we've got a really strong, really firm position with the United States, but as we've discovered, domestic politics plays out on both ends of that equation. The real short-term key question for our relationship with the United States is, if the current president is re-elected, what long-term impact will that have on our, not just our relationship, but the relationship between the United States and its other allies, particularly in the Indo-Pacific? We're going to have to, I think, look very long and hard at our relationship with our near region, with not just the Pacific Islands, but Indonesia and other countries, Japan, India, and on. We're entering a much more complex, I think, era into the future. When I look back as an historian, in hindsight, the last period since the Second World War has been fantastic for us. Up until recently, the US, since the Philippines in 1944, has been pretty much the uncontested maritime hegemon of the Indo-Pacific region, and that period is over, and we benefited fantastically from that. So it's going to take some really deep thinking, I think, from our senior military leaders, civilian leaders, politicians, about understanding a much more complex world and how we navigate it through it as a relatively declining power, compared to where we are today. And I think that's a big challenge for all of us. And core to that is going to be our relationship with the United States and where that goes and where its own political direction goes.
Thank you very much. This will be the final question before we bring proceedings to an end. Again, broadly to the panel. Effects versus potency. Does Australia have a case for an Indian Ocean patrol vessel program, and what would the strategic and economic implications for Australia be?
Just to check the question, are we talking about a Pacific Ocean patrol boat program that is equivalent to the Pacific patrol boat program?
It's unclear, but perhaps
okay.
we can
let me assume that is the proposal. I'd say there's probably potential for it, but given our limits on our resources, while I think there's while it's important to have a focus on the Indian Ocean as well, I think there is a different relationship of actors and security providers in the Indian Ocean. And I think, and the Australian government's actually said it explicitly, that we will we're very conscious of India's roles and interests, and frankly, we will consciously work with India. So my view would be that there may be a requirement, there may be, a potential for that, but it's something I'd actually do with India and probably accept an Indian lead, if one were to go down that path. And what I would say is that we have to be very careful about ensuring, understanding we do have relatively limited resources, and it is better to apportion labour in the way that follows logic. And this is where, for instance, and Nick had talked about it, I have concerns over some of the British Indo-Pacific military return, because I frankly believe that Britain should be focusing on the other hemisphere, because scale helps, and that Britain can achieve scale. Similarly, we should be doing things both in things like the Pacific Patrol Boat, but also in a wider naval and defence force context on a scale which actually makes a difference, and that's going to require choices. But we are not now in an era where simply turning up and putting a flag and having, that famous cartoon of the allocation of one soldier to Malaya and one to Vietnam and one to Borneo, where the modern equivalent is going to be credible. Because various countries will be able to say, that's very nice, and what are their names?
Thank you, James. Well, I think today, in all of the sessions, we've heard from some remarkable speakers from very, very diverse backgrounds, covering a lot of history. History is a rich well that we dig into to try and understand and learn from the past with a view to shaping our future. The answers are not always there, as we've heard. The world is a very, very different place now to what it was all those years ago, with many, many new challenges and different considerations. We've heard about globalisation, the economy, global warming. These are real issues that need to be dealt with in the 21st century. I think that in forums such as this, many of us actually understand that. All of these issues, though, when you wrap them up, affect or will affect our future way of life and the way of life to future generations. And I think that when that starts to actually begin to have that effect on our way of life, only then will people really start giving it the attention it deserves, and it likely will. But please join me in thanking today's speakers and the panel. Thank you also for attending this conference. For those tuning in from elsewhere around Australia and around the world, thank you too. And join me in a round of applause for our speakers and panellists.